of New Orleans. Now, we did get to the World War II Museum a little bit early before opening, which gave us some time to walk around the exterior of the building, which was really nice because they do have different statues that I thought were amazing. The first statue I saw was of Roosevelt on a bench with this quote right here. And then if you look down at the bricks, you'll see that the bricks have dedications that are written on them. In addition, there was the statue of Anne Frank as well. Now, I would absolutely recommend that you take some time to walk around before you head inside the museum, just so you can see all of these different statues, because they are pretty amazing. There's this one here that is dedicated to war dogs that served in the military, as well as the handlers that took care of these dogs, because the dogs actually did play a major role in the war, as they still do today. But my favorite one was this one right here with all of these different soldiers. You'll notice that some of the soldiers are colored slightly different. They represent the soldiers that have passed away, that are still kind of there watching over their fellow comrades. And each soldier, each statue represents a different soldier that was in the regiment for this artist, which I thought was absolutely beautiful. Now, when you walk in, you're going to see these planes that are overhead, that are suspended from the ceiling. And then there's also this train station that is kind of like a mock-up of what a train station is like. And so you can kind of get to see where your journey starts there. Much like the soldiers that went to war, your journey starts at this train station here. So you go inside of the train station, and then after you find your seat, you'll see that the seats are like made of wood, just in like a traditional old train. And then after you find your seat, this video plays on the screen that tells you a little bit about the journey of the men and how it started. Now, afterwards, we continue to look around the museum. There is this sign that tells you what you can expect to see on each one of the floors. So we decided that we wanted to start on the third floor, which is where the observation deck is. So we took the elevator up and we headed onto the third floor. So you got to see the airplane up close then. You really got a good look at the plane. And then you also got to see these motorcycles that were used during that time, which the first thing that came to my mind was, hey, that's the Cap's bike. That's Captain America's bike. So that's the first thing that came to my mind, as well as my husband's mind as well. And then you got a really good viewpoint of the museum. Now, they also have a special exhibit gallery that you can go through as well. And now this gallery does change from time to time. And today they had a bunch of different uniforms and photos that you could look at, which I always find really fascinating to look at the different photos and the letters from that time to kind of get a glimpse of what it was like then. Because, you know, most of us have only read about World War II in history books or learned about it from the different movies and everything that there are. So it is definitely kind of surreal to see everything in this way, with all of these different historic items. Now, my grandfather, like many others, fought in World War II. And unfortunately, my grandfather did die before I was born, so I never really got to talk to him. I never got to hear what his perspective was for during this time. Now, I remember my mom, she did tell me how my grandfather was drafted into the Army. something that he actually was not very happy about, because he was not one of those people that wanted to be a soldier. He always said that his proudest thing was that he went in a private and he came out a private. And so he really was proud of that fact. Not that he wasn't given the opportunity for promotions. He was actually very highly decorated, and he earned a Purple Heart as well as several other medals. However, he turned down every single promotion that was offered to him because he did not want to be responsible for getting any other man home. And the higher position you are, the more men, the more soldiers that are underneath you that you are in charge of, to make sure that they get home. And he said the only one that he wanted to make sure that he got home was himself. He did not want the burden of having the responsibility to make sure that anyone else got home other than himself. So whenever I go to a museum like this, it's hard to say, oh, I had a lot of fun. It was so much fun to go to, because, World War II was a very serious matter. And it was a pretty dark time for the entire world. So you can't really say, oh, I had fun when you went to the museum. But it definitely was very moving and very powerful to go. And, I did learn a lot at this museum when I went. I also remembered some things that I had forgotten, some things that I didn't really remember so as well as I thought I did. And so it was nice to get that refresher because, as they always say, history repeats itself. And that is very true. History definitely has a tendency to repeat itself. So the best way to try to stop something like this from happening again is to learn from it and to remember it. And when you have all these different information and these artifacts and these news articles, then you can't deny the history that happened, even though some people may try to deny it or to try to change what happened. You really can't do that when you have it presented in front of you. And when you look back at that time, to see what America went up against, this is how large the army was for the Nazi army as well as Japan compared to America. We were significantly outnumbered. And to think that, we had that. And, it's like in this exhibit here, you have the house divided, which shows you how America felt about going to war. Not everyone was for this war. They actually had polls that they did to decide if we should go to war or not. And so, because not everyone was for it. Now, of course, the majority of Americans were for the war. So you had about 68% that said yes and about 24% that said no. So this museum didn't focus just on the Germany half of the World War II. It also talked a lot about Japan, because, Japan with Hiroshima and everything definitely played a major part in the war, and our part in the war as well. So there's this video that tells you all about Hiroshima, and then it tells you about how America responded to that war and what we did and how life was after that happened, because things changed drastically. And then there was even this one area that talked about women's role in the war as well, and how women helped out in the factories and kind of took over while the men were away, and how they kind of filled the positions that men did at the time before the war. Now these things still need to get done and things still need to get made, and women kind of took over and did it. And so that's what this section was about here, and what women did. And it's quite amazing to see how much America changed because of World War II. Things definitely changed. Some good did come out of it, which is good. as far as like women's equality and everything. So that did actually make a big difference. Now, of course, one of the major turning points in the war for us was definitely the Manhattan Project. And they have an entire section that is all about the Manhattan Project, how it formed, and what the process was for all of these men that were a part of the Manhattan Project, which of course there is a movie about the Manhattan Project, which you could go and watch. This shows you kind of like what the room was like, where they would go and where they formed the idea of the Manhattan Project. And it has like different plans for it, so you can kind of see they have the blackboard that they wrote on. They, of course, you have the table of contents that you need for, the chemistry and everything. And so you can kind of get a glimpse of what it was like. There's pictures from back then and actual documents from back then. So that was pretty fascinating to see. Now, once we finished going through the Manhattan Project area, they had this one area that you walk into. It tells you about the different aircrafts and how to identify the different aircrafts, which I would not be able to tell you the different kinds of aircrafts at all. A plane is a plane and a gun is a gun. Like I have no difference. I cannot tell you the difference between any of them. But if you want to learn about that, they did tell you about what the difference were and how you could tell the difference between each one and identify each different aircraft as well as the different weapons as well. And then they also talked about segregation as well, because even though they did allow different men of color and everything and women of color to participate in the war, they definitely still had the segregation. So there was an entire section that talked about segregation for the military as well, and how the men and women of color during that time were treated. And so that was interesting to learn. You can see the suspicion and fear. This is talking about the Japanese people that lived in America during this time, because a lot of them were thought that they could possibly be, spies and everything. So you had that as well. And then here shows an example of what someone's dwelling house may have been like during that time. So, how things were furnished and decorated during this time. And which, I am a big architecture buff. I love going through old homes and stuff. So for me, this was definitely a highlight of the entire museum. I loved looking at all of the antique furnishings, and you can see the radio, which was a big part. That's how they didn't have TVs back then. So there was a radio in the living room. There's a radio in the kitchen. They had radios everywhere because they always were wanting to hear updates of the war. And so here is like an example of a kitchen on how, their kitchen may have looked and what items may have been in their kitchen as well. And their stove, what it may have looked like. One of the things that I thought was really interesting were these different cookbooks that they had, because, they had rations that they were on. So they had cookbooks that would tell you about different items that you can make with the rations that you had. So I thought that was pretty fascinating to see, because even how, people cooked back then changed, because their food options were not the same because of the sugar rations and everything. So they had that, which, war affects every single home. And so that is definitely true. So it was interesting to see how that was and how that changed. You even they had told you how things were for like when you went to the movies, and how, there was different ads that they played before the movies, for the war, that talked about the war, and of course, talked about getting your, bonds and everything. and how it affected everything. It affected day-to-day life. It affected the magazines that you bought on the street. And these are different examples of what the magazines may have looked like during that time. So as I mentioned before, the World War II Museum is quite large. So if you wanted to come and visit the museum, I would definitely suggest that you allot anywhere from 3 to even 5 hours to look around the museum, because my husband and I, we probably spent a little over 3 hours here, and we did not stop to read all of the little, notes and everything that they have, and description they had about everything. We did not stop to read everything. So if you are one of those people that likes to read every single little thing that is posted, this will definitely take you quite some time to go through. So you will want to plan most of your day here, because there is so much for you to read and for you to learn about. There are so many artifacts and everything that they have for this time period. It is kind of overwhelming, everything that they had here. There is so much information about Germany, about Japan, about D-Day that you could learn about. And it was just a lot of information to take in. I did not, like I said, we did not read all of the little things, and it still took us about 3 hours or so to go through the whole entire museum. But again, it is definitely something that I would suggest that you do, because you definitely learn some fascinating information, like this dummy here that, you see in the parachute. I learned how they did these as decoys, and this is what they kind of look like, which you don't think that people would fall for that, but when it's being from afar, from a distance, people thought that they were actually real people, and they named this one Rupert, which I thought was pretty funny, that they named the dummy, parachute. But yeah, they used to do that a lot to help kind of aid to where they wouldn't give away their true position on where they were, look here, not there kind of situation. So that was very interesting to learn about. Now, I also loved how the museum had almost like these like life-size dioramas of different areas. So you kind of feel like you are like in the jungle in Japan or whatnot, and you can see what it was like, what it actually looked like, to kind of be there. And this shows you what like a plane crash may have looked like with the vehicle that was in there, amongst all of the trees and everything. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. And then you cross over this bridge to get you over to the other half of the building, because as I mentioned, this has multiple buildings. And so you cross over the bridge to get to the other side of the building, and there they have some more planes and everything suspended from the ceiling that you could look at. And again, they have plaques and everything that you can read. You can also pick up these dog tags here. Now these dog tags, you grab one of the cards and then you register it over at this computer screen. You go ahead and you register it, and then you will be assigned a person. And then there are different areas that you can go to kind of activate it, and it will tell you about that person throughout their time and what they were doing at this point in time in history. And then by the time of the end of your journey, you find out if that person survived World War II or if they unfortunately died during World War II. So after you cross over the bridge, you enter another building that is part of the museum. And of course, there is a aircraft that is suspended from the ceiling. And then you head down the hallway, and there are several different rooms in this building that you can explore. There's a video that tells you about, this time period of the war. And then there's also another room that kind of talks about the victims and those who died in the war. It tells you about how many victims were actually civilians and several of them were children. And then it talks about how this is the deadliest war in human history to date. And it has different items from the people that lived during that time, both men and women, as well as children as well, and things that they may have owned in war during that time. And then there is an example of the headstone. So this headstone is for someone who was Jewish that died during that time, as well. It has the casket that their bodies were sent home in. And then you also have the regular standard headstone as well, which of course is the cross. And so you had these different headstones, and these are what the men who died in the military had. Now, of course, Anne Frank, who did not, read Anne Frank diary, the diary of Anne Frank when you were in school. So everyone knows about Anne Frank. And so they have a whole exhibit that shows you what life was like in the annex for Anne Frank and her family. And there are pictures everywhere that you can see, as well as this one right here, which is the most famous picture of her sitting at her desk, which her desk is right here, and while she wrote in her diary. And then it shows you what the rest of their living quarters may have looked like, what it looked like during that time, and which for the most part looked pretty normal. They even had a little kitchen area that had a little stove that they could use to cook food as well. It definitely was not as large as the typical kitchen that we saw before, but they definitely had a little bit of stuff. So this is what life for them was like in the annex during that time while they were in hiding. And then they tell you about what life was like in the Holocaust for a lot of people, which obviously was a horrible time in history for us. And then we see different pictures of soldiers. Once you walk out of that area, you see different soldiers, as well as the different medals that many of the soldiers came home with. Now, one thing that a lot of people do not think about when they think about the war, a lot of people think about the Holocaust and they think about all that, but they don't think about art. And, during this time, there was a huge raid on art. And so a lot of the Nazis would steal art from either owners, like Jewish people who owned these different paintings and everything, or from museums and things. They would steal it. And so there's actually a special unit in the army that got together so that they could actually uncover and find all of the art that was stolen by the Nazis. So I thought that was very fascinating to learn about, because it is something that, again, I heard a little bit about it from Indiana Jones and stuff, but it was nice to kind of read about it and learn about it in person. Then we went into another building. This was the Road to Berlin. So this was all about the Germany part of the war, and how Germany was kind of taking over Europe, and our part on how we played on, recapturing that, and, helping out, and how we got together with other countries to band together against Nazi Germany. And then it had these diagrams, these life-size dioramas, which I really loved the life-size dioramas, because it really makes you feel like you are there. It is a great way to kind of see firsthand how things were. And this area talked all about the strategy that was behind the war and us living the war. And then there's this bunker, and you could see overhead it had the planes on what it looked like, during that time as planes were flying above. And you see, the pictures. So this is what it may have been like. And then you go through this jungle area. So I really thought that was really neat. It wasn't just a basic museum just with things hanging on the wall and everything. I thought that this museum does its best to kind of make you feel like you are there. You're not just looking at a bunch of stuff that is all over, and you're not looking at a bunch of, artifacts and everything. Like, they have it set up in a way like you are there. They have the surroundings that makes you feel like you are going back in time, and as though you are witnessing this firsthand. And I thought that was very entertaining. So I did really enjoy this, and like through this part here, you could hear the different comms and the shouting on the radio, and you could hear the guns going off, and so it was definitely interesting. So yeah, it was really great. I did enjoy how it was more than just your typical museum, because so often when you go to a museum, it is just, walls with stuff. And this is more than just walls with stuff. And they had things presented in a way that were very interesting and made you want to learn more about it. And it made you want to be like, hey, what is that thing that I'm looking at right there? That's pretty interesting. Why is it like that? And so I really enjoyed that. I thought that was probably the best thing about this museum, and which probably makes it the top of it. Now, they also, in addition to the Berlin, they had the road to Tokyo. So this would tell you all about Tokyo. This shows you what a part of like the sub, what it was like being under a sub. And this tells you about our allies that we had, everyone who kind of worked together against Japan and everything. So we got to learn a lot about that, which was really great. And on the Tokyo part, it's like you are walking through a ship. So you can see all of the interior. It definitely was like you were on a ship or a submarine and you were walking through it. And so that's how it was presented. So each building had its own theme, had its own feel for it, and each one was designed, each building is designed differently to help make you feel like you are in that section of that part in time in history. And so I thought that was really fascinating. There was a lot of different weapons and everything during that time to show you, because they didn't all just have the same basic gun. There was tons of different weapons that were used during that time, and you get to see that. There was different TV shows that were up that showed you about what was going on, and glimpses into what it was like during that time. So yeah, definitely, if you have a chance going to a World War II museum, you definitely should go. It was really fascinating. Like I said, it was more than just your typical stuff on walls kind of museum. They presented things in a very interesting way so that you don't get bored just walking around. You have something different to look at every single time, because honestly, it can get kind of repetitive. Look at a uniform, look at a gun, look at this letter, look at this. So it gets pretty repetitive, I think, typically when you walk through a museum and you see stuff like that. But how they have things presented here, I thought kept things very interesting. I really enjoyed how they had the different dioramas and how you could walk through it. I really thought that was great. But in addition to that, they did have the stuff. So they did have the medals, they did have the letters, they did have the uniforms that you could look at. And there was just so much stuff for you to look at. You could see the posters that they had during that time. And you got to see the toys and the electronics and how that was for during that time and that period. And you can see how things have grown so much. And so I thought that was really great to see. And you got to see all of the different aircrafts, because there were so many different aircrafts during that time period. And they had examples of every single one of them, and you could see them from each floor as they were suspended from the ceiling, and you got to see them really up close. You could go to that observation deck. Each building had the observation deck to where you could see the buildings from up top as well, and you could get Also down on the ground, they had the vehicles, they had the medic vehicle, and they had the different tanks and everything. So you could get to see those up close as well. Then they also had this simulation of a sub that you could see that told you all about the Tang. So the Tang was a sub that actually there was a malfunction and it caused them to sink. However, they have this simulation that tells you about what it was like for them during that time.
Those ships we sunk yesterday were headed south and piled high with cargo. They must be gearing up for a big offensive in the Philippines.
Captain, priority dispatch.
24 October, 2200 hours. Japanese supply convoy proceeding south along China coast. If we can disrupt the enemy supply lines, we can shorten the length of this war. Make your course due west for Turnabout Island and the Formosa Strait.
Aye, aye, Captain.
Men, our job is to intercept and destroy as many enemy ships as possible. We have 9 fish loaded in our torpedo tubes and 2 more waiting to be loaded. More than enough firepower to destroy this convoy. Chief of the boat, prepare to surface.
You heard the chief. Man your station.
When they talk about fish, they're talking about the torpedoes. And push, turn, pull, whatever you're interested in.
All clear for.
All ahead standard.
Answering all ahead, standard on 2.
All ahead.
Captain, flagship now out ahead of port. Proceeding southwest.
Aye, aye, sir.
Heavy plans to go, Captain. The outer doors are open forward.
Aye, aye, sir.
Captain, supporter approaching on the fourth bow. She's coming in fast. Guard, half doors open. Punch, clear. Mark. Set. Fire. Torpedo 8 away. Captain, supporter 500 yards. Coming in the range.
So this is what the loading area of the torpedoes, or the fish as they called them, this is what that loading area looked like. Now we learned through the simulation that for the Tang, how they ended up dying was that there was actually a malfunction of one of the torpedoes that caused the sub to sink. Now, miraculously, there were actually 5 survivors from that sinking, which is unheard of today. Even now, if a sub goes down, everyone's pretty much going to die.
I'm the last living survivor of only 5 men ever in the world to have escaped successfully from a sunken submarine on their own.
Next up, we headed over to the other special exhibit that they had at the museum, which was all about Hitler's war on modern art. So as we learned earlier, Hitler was a lover of art, but he was a lover of traditional art. He was not a fan of modern art, because a lot of modern artists were also very politically minded, as well as the modern music as well. So for jazz music and swing music, Hitler did not agree with that. He did not like that. He did not like how it made the people feel rebellious. And he felt it gave them too much freedom. And he definitely wanted control over that. And so that is why Hitler did not like modern art. You know, a lot of the modern artists showed the truth on how life was during that time, and they showed prostitutes and everything. He did not like that. He did not like having that mirror shown in front of him about how the country was. He wanted people to think that Germany was a certain way when it wasn't, and so he wanted to get control over that. And so there's this timeline that shows you the different events for like the propaganda that happened during that time period, and how Hitler wanted to control the voice of the people, and he wanted to control that. Now, after that, going through that exhibit, we walked through the souvenir shop that was there, which was a pretty decent souvenir shop. They had toys and, of course, shirts and hats and everything. So it was a really nice